The formal complaint arrived on a Tuesday, which I thought was appropriate. Tuesdays were already the worst day of the week aboard Kelevar Station, and now they had documentation to prove it. I read it twice, standing at my workbench with a cooling mug of tea beside me and a partially disassembled manifold coupling in my left hand. The complaint was 6 pages long. 6 pages to complain about a repair bay. I had to admire the commitment, genuinely. Most people who disapprove of something simply disapprove of it and move on to disapproving of something else. Veth-Grade, it appeared, was the kind of person who put his disapproval into organized paragraphs with a numbered appendix. The summary on page 1 was the part that stayed with me. Bay 7, that was us. Me and my 4-person crew, was described as operationally substandard, an embarrassment to joint station maintenance doctrine, and, my personal favorite, reliant on pre-industrial methodology, incompatible with the Veth engineering framework. The summary's final sentence recommended our decommissioning. I set the manifold coupling down, picked up my tea, found it cold, and set it back. My name is Selah Marsh. I have been running Bay 7 on Kelevar Station for 11 years. Before that, I did 9 years aboard a deep survey tender in the Outer Belt, where the nearest Veth-certified service facility was 4 weeks transit in any direction, and everything that broke, we fixed with what we had. Before that, I did 3 years in an orbital construction yard on the night shift, learning the difference between how equipment is supposed to fail and how it actually fails. And before that, I spent 2 years working for a woman named Dorrit, who had been maintaining spacecraft drive systems for 30 years when I met her, who could diagnose a pressurized coolant fault by sound alone, who had opinions about diagnostic software that I will not repeat in polite company because they were accurate and therefore unkind, and who told me on my first day that the most important thing in this trade was not the tools you had been certified to use, but the things you had learned to notice. That is 25 years of maintenance work. I mention it only because Veth-Grade's complaint had apparently not consulted my record before being filed, or had consulted it and decided it was not relevant to the analysis. I was not sure which option was more instructive. I folded the complaint in half, tucked it into the top drawer of my workbench, and went back to the manifold coupling. Kelevar Station occupied a mid-orbit position above the 4th planet in the Aaron system, which made it exactly the kind of installation that ends up being useful to everyone, without being specifically important to anyone. The Veth had built the station's core infrastructure 20 years ago as part of the Joint Settlement Accords. They brought the drive technology, the long-range arrays, the climate systems, the administrative framework, and enough structural engineering expertise to put something the size of a small city block into stable orbit in 14 months. Humanity brought, among other things, the dockworkers, the mechanics, the supply chain coordinators, and a kitchen staff whose work was, in my unverified opinion, the actual reason the station's human population remained as large as it did. The Veth were tall, uniformly taller than any human I had worked with, and smooth-skinned in the way that some materials are smooth, not soft, but evenly finished, as though surfaced rather than grown. They moved with a deliberateness that looked unhurried even when they were genuinely in a hurry, and they communicated in layered tonal clusters that the translation hardware rendered as complete sentences with a small processing lag that I had learned over the years to treat as a thoughtful pause rather than a hesitation. After 11 years, I barely noticed the lag. In the early days, it had given me the consistently incorrect impression that every Veth I dealt with was carefully considering their words, and I had found some of them considerably less deliberate in their thinking than the pause implied. Their institutional culture was built around the concept of validated process, not process as a general value. Most institutions claim to value process in the abstract, and what they actually mean is that they want credit for having a process without the overhead of following it. The Veth meant it specifically. Every procedure had a documented protocol. The protocol had an authorized tool list. The tools were Veth manufactured, calibrated to Veth standards, and the technicians executing the procedure held credentials issued by the Veth Technical Directorate. The credential framework had examination grades and an oversight body and a formal review process, and any maintenance work performed outside the framework was, in the Directorate's taxonomy, unvalidated regardless of outcome. I held no Veth credentials. Neither did anyone on my crew. Bay 7 had come into being during the station's construction period, when the Veth drive systems were going in, and the human installation teams needed a facility to maintain the human machinery they were using for the installation work: tool carts, lifting frames, small shuttle drives, atmospheric equipment. Equipment the Veth technical staff did not service and had no organizational reason to think about. The bay had been understood as temporary at the time. Temporary in the way that infrastructure sometimes becomes. It persists past the circumstance that created it. It accumulates purpose and history, and eventually it becomes permanent in all practical ways while remaining technically provisional in the documentation. No one had formally designated Bay 7 as permanent. It simply kept being here. By the time I arrived at Kelevar, Bay 7 had been operating for 9 years and had developed a reputation of the kind that useful things develop without announcements. Word of mouth among people who needed equipment fixed and had learned where equipment actually got fixed. We serviced human shuttle drives, human atmospheric and climate equipment, human port machinery. We serviced Veth auxiliary systems when the work was within our technical reach. The owning party signed a liability waiver, acknowledging the work was outside the certified framework, which some did and some did not, and I did not push either way. We serviced the mixed manufacture environmental exchangers in the civilian habitation ring, units that had been translated through 4 technical languages over their service life, and were now documented simultaneously in 3, and that nobody else on the station wanted to touch, because the documentation was a contradiction in at least 2 of those languages, and the physical units disagreed with all of them. We had fabricated replacement parts from raw stock when listed spares weren't available. We had developed diagnostic techniques that were not in any certified manual. We had accumulated 11 years of fault records in the charts above the main console, cross-referencing every anomaly, every repair, every system behavior that did not match the official documentation, and we had used those records to catch things that formal methods had missed. The most recent fabricated part before the complaint arrived was a pressure regulation valve for a water reclamator in the civilian ring. The listed replacement was a certified Veth auxiliary component, which would have been correct if the reclamator were a Veth auxiliary system. It was not. It was a 12-year-old mixed manufacture unit that had been retrofitted twice and was now running on a specification no single manufacturer's catalog matched. I had made the valve on the bay's lathe, pressure tested it to operating spec on the analog rig, installed it, and the reclamator had been running without incident for 4 months before the complaint was filed. This was mentioned in the complaint as an example of the problem. I spent some time with that section of the document because it was genuinely clarifying. The complaint did not argue that the reclamator had failed. It argued that fabricating a non-certified component violated maintenance doctrine, regardless of outcome, and that the appropriate response to a missing listed part was escalation through procurement channels, not improvisation in the shop. He was not wrong about the doctrine. The doctrine said exactly what he said. The water had been running clean for 4 months, but that was not the metric he was measuring. He was measuring process alignment, not operational result. These are 2 different evaluations. They produce 2 different sets of answers. And I had been in this trade long enough to understand that the difference between them matters enormously when you need to know which one is being applied to your work. I closed the drawer on the complaint and told Orun about it over lunch. Orun Feck had been my deputy chief for 8 years. He was a quiet, compact man who had come to maintenance work from a background in survey instrumentation, precision measurement, calibration, the discipline of reading instruments correctly under conditions that made correct reading difficult. He had a particular gift for fault diagnosis that I had rarely encountered in its specific form. The ability to hold several competing explanations for a symptom in parallel, without committing to any of them, until the data closed the options. Most technicians, including good ones, anchor to an early hypothesis and weight subsequent evidence toward it. Orun didn't anchor. He held the possibilities open until the fault told him which one was right. This made him slower at some routine tasks and reliably correct on the important ones. He listened to the summary of the complaint without visible reaction. Then he said, 6 pages. I said 6 pages. He considered it. What did he say about the charts? Pre-industrial methodology. The pressure sensors specifically he called unnecessary and unvalidated. Instrumentation. He called the sensors instrumentation. He's not wrong, they are instrumentation. Not what he meant by the word, though. No. Orun ate for a moment. He's not wrong that we're outside the validated framework. He's not. And in principle, there are better equipped facilities. In principle. The difference, Orun said, is whether the better equipped facilities are actually available here, I said. That's the difference. We went back to work. Vel Sanath I had met in person once before the complaint arrived, about 3 months prior. He had come through Bay 7 on what he described as an administrative inspection, though he had not notified us in advance, had not asked to see our service logs or equipment records, and had not interviewed the crew, which is what an administrative inspection usually involves. He had arrived, stood in the middle of the floor, and looked around. The bay has a particular quality when someone unfamiliar with it first stands in it. The combination of organized density and evident age, the tool racks with their specific arrangements, the lathe and mill on the fabrication side showing years of careful use, the 2 pressure test rigs against the south wall with their analog gauge banks and manifold assemblies, and above the main console, the fault charts. The charts cover most of the wall above the console. 6 large sheets pinned edge to edge, covered in hand-drawn schematics in 3 different handwriting styles, annotated over 11 years with every fault we had diagnosed, every repair we had made, every system behavior that didn't match the official documentation. Bress, who had worked with me for 6 years before moving on, had developed a compact notation system that needed a small key to decode but allowed a great deal of information to fit in a small space. Orun's annotations were precise and spatial. He tended to draw fault locations rather than describe them. Mine ran more to text with specific measurements noted. The charts were a working record, not a display. They were marked up because we used them. Sanath stood in the middle of the floor and looked at the charts with the expression of a person encountering something they had assumed was rhetorical. He was in the directorate's formal liaison uniform. Charcoal, with shoulder markings indicating his grade level, and his hands were clasped behind him with the specific precision of someone maintaining a deliberate posture rather than a natural one. He was taller than most of the Veth on the station, which made him considerably taller than me, and he had a way of looking around a space that took in all of it and categorized it in a single sustained assessment. I had seen that kind of look before from people conducting inspections in their professional capacity. It was the look of someone generating a report. He looked at the workbenches. He looked at the tool racks. He looked at the pressure test rigs, which are not elegant objects. They are functional ones, assembled in rack frames, built for durability and accuracy rather than appearance. With the expression of someone encountering equipment they had not expected to still be in operation. He looked at the fabrication side, where the lathe was in mid-job, chuck still loaded with the previous session's work. Eventually, he said that he was surprised to see diagnostic records maintained in physical form. I said the charts had started as a backup for the integrated network and had continued because we found them useful. He looked at me in the way the Veth do when they are deciding what to say. The look that the translation lag amplifies slightly, So you watch their face settle into the response while waiting for the words. He said that the directorate maintained all diagnostic and operational records in the station network, accessible from any certified terminal, and that physical documentation was redundant, and suggested either a lack of confidence in the network or unfamiliarity with its full capabilities. I said we were familiar with the network. I said the charts showed things the network didn't capture. Fault progression patterns across time, cross-system connections that didn't appear in individual query results, the spatial reasoning that came from reading a physical layout rather than a sequential data return. I said we used both. He looked at me with the patient certainty of a person who has heard someone describe a preference and knows it is a preference rather than a method. The look that said, "This is an explanation someone gives for a habit they haven't examined." I didn't push further. It wouldn't have been useful, and it would have made the next conversation harder. After he left, Oren had watched the door for a moment. He said, I don't think he'd ever seen fault charts as working documents. He's seen them historically, pre-network maintenance practice. Did he understand what they were for? He understood what they were. He thought we kept them out of habit. Oren considered that, and we keep them because the network shows you the data it was built to collect. The charts show what you've noticed over time. They're not the same record. Oren nodded and went back to work. He didn't need the explanation. He was checking whether my account of it was accurate. It was the sort of thing he did. 3 weeks after the complaint, the Veth diplomatic convoy filed its layover request. The notification came through the station administrative channel. All maintenance-relevant notifications came to our secondary console, and convoy layovers generated them because they affected docking allocation. The convoy was 6 weeks out. 5 ships, standard transit corridor routing, 4-day resupply and maintenance layover, sensitive cargo classification, enhanced security protocol. The 5 ships were the Resolute Clarity, a Veth heavy carrier, built with the structural density that placed it somewhere between a cargo vessel and a warship in practical terms, and 4 escort ships, lighter and faster, carrying the communication arrays that indicated the people aboard had access to traffic they intended to keep private. There was a council delegation aboard en route to treaty negotiations in a neighboring system. Kelevar was the logical stop, mid-corridor, adequate docking capacity, joint station status that simplified the procedural arrangements for diplomatic personnel. The layover had been planned months in advance. In the weeks before the convoy's arrival, Velsanath became considerably more visible on the station. He was conferring with the Veth technical staff at their main bay, walking the docking approach corridor with a physical clipboard that I noted with mild interest, appearing in the administrative ring at hours when he wasn't normally there. The convoy's arrival clearly represented something important to him, a period when the station would be operating at full visibility to people whose assessments of it carried institutional weight, when the directorate's work would be on display, when everything needed to be correct. Bay 7 was not assigned to convoy maintenance support. The 3 Veth-certified bays on the main dock received that assignment. We were to maintain normal operations and keep clear of the convoy docking corridor. This was sensible. We had our own work. The shuttle drive rebuild that had been waiting on a part, now ready to proceed, and the pressure seal replacement on the secondary waste reclamation loop that Oran had been postponing for reasons of morale and could no longer justify deferring. We went on doing what we did. The convoy arrived on schedule. I watched the approach on the secondary display for a few minutes. 5 ships moving in the formation geometry that indicated professional pilots operating under formal protocol, and then turned back to the shuttle drive. The fault declared itself on the second day of the layover at 3:40 station time. The alert tone I used for Bay 7 emergencies is specific and not subtle. I had programmed it that way deliberately. If someone on my crew had decided the situation warranted waking me, I did not want to sleep through the notification. I was on my feet before I was fully awake. It was a run. His voice was steady, which told me the situation was real but not yet cascading. He said, "Resonance pattern developing in the station's main drive buffer, low frequency. Our pressure sensors have been logging it for approximately 90 minutes. I've been watching it build before calling you." He paused. "The Veth technical team has been running diagnostics for 40 minutes. Their array keeps returning clean." I was already moving. The main drive buffer was the capacitance regulator network that managed the station's primary power distribution. The piece of infrastructure that everything else aboard depended on, running on Veth drive technology, serviced exclusively by Veth credentialed technicians, and completely outside Bay 7's operational scope. Under any normal definition of our job, it was not our problem. I said, "The Veth diagnostic suite is reading clean while your sensors are reading a developing fault." "Yes." 90 minutes of increasing amplitude, currently concentrated in panels 7 through 14, middle ring section. The frequency range. He gave me the numbers. I sat with those numbers for a moment. Then I knew where I had heard them. I said, "Don't touch anything. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Bay 7 at 0355 had the quality that maintenance spaces have at night. Overhead panels at working crew level. Bench lights on where someone had been active. The rest in the institutional half-dark that makes equipment look heavier than it is. Orun had the primary display running with the sensor feed. He had also taken down the relevant section of the fault charts from the wall, the section covering the station's drive infrastructure, and spread it across the main console work surface. He had been adding to it. Blue ink for the current sensors readings, pencil for the cross-references, working carefully and without rushing in the way he worked when the situation was serious and urgency would not help. I looked at the chart. The harmonic pattern was concentrating toward the inner ring of the buffer panels, with the amplitude gradient characteristic of a resonance building from an internal point source, rather than propagating inward from the periphery, which meant it was coming from a degrading component inside the ring itself, not from an external vibration source. The gradient pointed toward panel 9, strongest near the housing junction at the inner circumference. I looked at the cross-reference Orun had penciled in. It pointed to an entry 18 months old, in Bress's compact notation. A Veth auxiliary drive unit, one of several that had come to us from a certified bay that was backed up. Intermittent fault, diagnostic suite repeatedly returning clean. We had shut off the software suite, connected the analog pressure rig, and worked the unit section by section until we found it. A low-frequency harmonic in the third dampener housing from the outer ring, the signature falling precisely in the frequency band the diagnostic software filtered as ambient noise. The software's parametric calibration was set for the fault signature the dampeners produced at structural compromise, at the point of actual failure, not the signature they produced at early onset, months before failure, when the matrix material was beginning to microfracture under cumulative resonance load. The suite was calibrated to recognize the fire. The analog rig heard the smoke. We had found the fault, replaced the dampener units, and logged the service record. Bress had noted the failure mode and the frequency range in the chart. That notation was what Orun had cross-referenced. The numbers from tonight matched it, scaled up by the factor of the buffer ring size relative to the auxiliary unit, considerably larger, but the harmonic signature was the same failure mode propagating along the same physical logic, detectable by the same method. I looked at Orun. He was watching me in the way he watched situations, when he already had a conclusion and was waiting to see whether my reasoning reached the same place. I said, "The diagnostic suite's parametric filter is masking the precursor signature. Same problem as the auxiliary unit 18 months ago," he said. "I thought so. I didn't want to call it before you'd looked at the chart." I said, "At this rate of progression, how long before structural compromise in the dampeners?" he said. "My estimate is 5 to 8 hours. If the cascade reaches structural compromise, sections of the distribution network fail. Station power management shifts to backup capacity. Backup doesn't cover full operational load. The Resolute Clarity and her escorts were at dock. The convoy departure window opened in 9 hours. I said, call Director Palev. Institutional conversations of this kind move at their own pace, which is faster than you want when you're standing with a problem in your hands and slower than you need when the clock is visible. The pace is set by the organizational requirement for the right people to hear the information, process it, and authorize the response. The requirement is legitimate even when it is inconvenient. And I had learned over the years that the way to work with it rather than against it was to give the information clearly, without editorializing, and let the people with the authority make the decision at their own speed. Director Palev took my call at 0415 and listened without interrupting while I described what we had. The sensor readings, the frequency range, the historical match from the service record, the nature of the diagnostic blind spot that was preventing the Veth suite from detecting the fault. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, her version of processing, not hesitation, and then said she needed Overseer Damath before authorizing. Work outside the certified maintenance framework and asked me to hold. I held. Orun made tea. I drank it, which was sensible. 35 minutes later, we were in a briefing room on the administrative level. Me, Director Palev, Overseer Damath, and Veth, who had been summoned or had arrived on his own initiative. I didn't ask which. Damath was the senior engineer on the station's Veth technical staff. He had the manner of someone who had been doing this specific kind of work for a long time. Economical movement, direct attention, the particular stillness of a person who does not spend energy on things that are not the current problem. I had dealt with him on Bay-level matters twice in 11 years and found him, both times, to be the kind of engineer I respected. Someone whose primary interest was whether the analysis was correct, rather than whether it confirmed his prior expectation. He had the Veth diagnostic array output on his tablet. It was reading clean, 90 minutes of clean readings, while our pressure sensors had been logging increasing amplitude in the same panel section. He looked at the tablet display. He looked at it the way you look at an instrument you trust completely that is disagreeing with your direct observation, trying to determine which one is correct. I put Orun's annotated chart on the briefing room table. It was a piece of paper, hand-drawn, covered in 3 sets of handwriting and 11 years of annotations. It sat on the briefing room table between a Veth senior engineer's tablet and joint station director, and it was the document with the answer in it. Damath looked at it, not quickly. He read it carefully, following the cross-reference from the current readings to the 18-month-old entry, tracing the frequency range annotations. He had the look of a person reading something that was informing them of a thing they had not known, which is a specific expression and different from the look of a person reading something they already know. He said, "Your independent sensors detected this pattern without any integration with the station network," I said. "Correct. Analog vibration monitors, structural mounted. We installed them 4 years ago after a sensor network gap briefly blinded us to a coolant issue. They're not networked. They read mechanical vibration independently." He said, "They are outside the validated framework." I said, "Yes." He said, "And this historical entry." He touched the cross-reference, a previous fault. "Same signature," I said, 18 months ago, an auxiliary drive unit. Smaller scale, same harmonic characteristics. The service record is in the station logs, Bay 7, date stamped. I gave him the date. He pulled up the station log on his tablet, found the entry, and read it. Then he looked at the frequency numbers from tonight's sensor data. Then he looked at the numbers in the chart. They were the same numbers, the same frequency range, the same gradient profile, the same spatial concentration pattern. He said carefully, "Our parametric filter removes signals in this frequency band as ambient," I said. "The calibration is set for the full degradation fault signature, the harmonic the dampeners produce when the matrix material has already fractured to the point of structural failure. The early onset signature, which appears months before that, falls inside the filter's noise threshold. At standard calibration, the suite cannot see it. Vel-Sanath said something in the tonal register, the translation hardware rendered as a procedural clarification request. Damath said something back. The hardware rendered it as not now. Damath said to me, "Your proposed approach to locate the fault," I said. "Our analog pressure rig, direct connection to the buffer ring access panels. I work the crawlways with a handheld probe and follow the harmonic gradient toward the source. When I have the specific housing location, we isolate manually and proceed to extraction. The dampener units are modular, remove and replace," he said. "The replacement stock is in Directorate stores." I said, "I know. I'll need your team's support on the drive side fittings. Those connections are outside our tool certification, and I wouldn't attempt them without your technicians present. We handle the diagnostic work, the probe, and the isolation." He said, "Time estimate." I said, 2 hours to locate and isolate precisely. 3 to 4 more for extraction and replacement with your team on the fittings. 6 hours total if the fault is where the gradient indicates. Director Palev said, "The convoy window opens in 9 hours. Nobody commented on the arithmetic. 9 hours minus 6 hours left 3 hours of margin, which was thin by every formal standard and the only margin available. Damath said, "Fordernize the work." Overseer Damath's senior technician was a Veth named This, and within 4 minutes of conversation, I understood that we would work together without difficulty. He communicated in compressed technical language that the hardware rendered as extremely brief, complete sentences, and he had the specific quality of someone who had been doing very particular technical work for long enough that they no longer needed to discuss it at length. He knew the buffer ring extraction procedures. His team of 3 had the tooling staged before I had finished explaining what we needed. What This's team had not done before was locate a fault using analog probe technique on a live ring, because the normal procedure was to let the diagnostic suite identify the location before any physical access work. The suite was currently not identifying the location. I explained the probe method, what we were reading, how the amplitude gradient directed the search, what the concentrated signature looked like when you were close to the source. This listened without interrupting, repeated the key parameters back to me in 8 words, and said his team would hold at the access station until I had a housing location. I got the probe rig from the bay cart and went into the crawlways. The buffer ring access runs between the capacitance regulator housings in a series of passages that are not designed for extended occupancy. Low clearance, tight at the housing junctions, the air carrying the specific combination of metal and residual charge that large drive infrastructure builds up over years of operation. The regulator housings are substantial in the way that equipment doing serious work is substantial, not threatening but heavy with consequence. The kind of equipment you are continuously aware of your proximity to, even with the isolation protocols engaged and the stored charge discharged. I had worked in tighter spaces. I had worked in worse air. I went in and followed the gradient. The probe was an instrument I had built 6 years ago from a piezo sensor element mounted in a cast housing, connected to a gauge unit by a shielded cable. The assembly sized to fit through the narrowest access passages with the gauge readable by torchlight. 40 hours of bench time. I had used it in several hundred fault locations since and trusted it more than most of the certified diagnostic equipment. I had worked with over 25 years, which was a statement about this specific instrument and the specific conditions it was built for rather than a statement about certification in general. The certified equipment was built for a different set of conditions. Neither one was universally better. They were tools. I worked from the outer panels inward, reading the amplitude gradient at each housing junction, moving toward the stronger readings. The fault was in panel 9. The harmonic was loudest at the 3rd dampener housing from the outer ring. The amplitude concentrated in exactly the spatial pattern that the auxiliary unit's failure had taught us to expect. A point source harmonic radiating outward from the failing matrix material, strongest where the matrix was most compromised, decaying in a gradient that pointed directly back to the source if you followed it correctly. I marked the housing with the chalk I'd brought, came back out, and told Orun, who was monitoring the access panel station, and who noted the location on the chart with a green mark and the time. Veth was still in the access bay. He had been there when I went in, standing near the monitoring station with his hands at his sides rather than clasped behind him, which was a different posture than I had seen him in before. He watched me come out of the crawlway. He watched me report the location to Orun. He did not say anything. I was not thinking about Veth at that point. I went to find this. The extraction work took 4 hours and 50 minutes from first crawlway access to final verification pass. This was longer than I had estimated, and within the range I had told Director Palev, and I mention it because the difference between those two numbers is the difference between what the job looks like from the outside and what it requires from the inside. The drive side fittings on the buffer ring were not like the fittings on the auxiliary unit. They were larger, more deeply integrated into the housing architecture, requiring a Veth-specific torque sequence and a fitting tool geometry that existed because the fittings had been designed to prevent incorrect installation rather than to facilitate easy removal. This was sensible engineering. It also meant that This's team worked through the extraction procedure with a methodical care that I watched closely, because watching people who are expert in a specific technical domain work inside it is one of the more efficient ways to learn things that are not in any manual. 2 of the 3 dampener units at the identified location were compromised. The crystalline matrix material had developed microfracturing under the accumulated resonance load, the same failure mode as the auxiliary unit, the same visual presentation of the fracture pattern, the same failure mechanism at a proportionally larger scale. The 3rd unit was marginal. The matrix showed early stress patterns that predicted failure under continued loading. This examined it for 10 seconds with the attention of a person running an internal calculation, then removed it without discussion. I would have made the same call. The replacement units went in. This handled the drive side fittings. I ran the pressure rig verification pass, reading each new dampener as it came online, watching the frequency bands on the gauge. Panel 14 cleared. Panel 12 cleared. Panel 9 cleared. Panel 8. The harmonic that had been building in those bands for 6 hours diminished section by section as the replacement. Units took load and the resonance found no fractured matrix to amplify it. The final gauge reading came up clean at 4 hours and 50 minutes. I noted the time and came out of the access crawlway. Orun was at the monitoring station with coffee, which was the correct operational decision. I drank it. He marked the chart. Green notation, fault close, time and date, and we stood for a moment in the access bay in the particular quiet that follows a job when it has gone the way it was supposed to go. Veth was gone. This's team were packing their extraction tooling with the efficiency of people who packed extraction tooling often and had developed a system for it. I thanked This, who said something brief that translated as acknowledgement and mutual competence, which was the appropriate register. I went back to Bay 7 and wrote up the service log entry while the details were current. The convoy departed 12 minutes inside the scheduled window. I watched it on the secondary display. 5 ships clearing the docking approach in sequence, the escorts first, the resolute clarity last, moving with the careful deliberateness of a large vessel, leaving a confined space before the open distance allows full drive engagement. The visual scan display showed the drive fields spreading as each ship cleared the corridor, the specific pattern of a Veth drive system coming up to transit power, which I had seen hundreds of times and which still had the quality of something worth watching when you knew what you were looking at. Then the display returned to the station operations view, and I turned it off. I cleaned the pressure rig. I coiled the probe cable correctly and stowed the housing. I updated the service log. I tacked the buffer ring chart section back on the wall in its place, the blue and red annotations from the night's work visible at the top of the sheet, cross-reference to the 18-month-old entry in Bress's compact notation at the bottom. Director Palev called an hour later. She thanked me. She said she was filing a supplementary operations report that would document Bay 7's role, the fault detection methodology, and the historical service record. She said Overseer Dameth had requested a technical exchange with our team at his initiative to understand the analog monitoring system and the chart methodology. I said we were available when his schedule allowed. She said, he also wanted me to tell you that the Directorate is reviewing the parametric calibration specifications for the main diagnostic suite. I said, that's a good idea. A brief pause, she said. Good work, Marsh, and the call ended. I put the kettle on. Vel Sanath came to Bay 7 2 days after the convoy departed. He came in the morning, alone without the clipboard. He waited at the entrance for a moment before I walked over to meet him. Orun was at his bench with the shuttle drive rebuild, which was proceeding correctly. The 2 other crew members were on the waste reclamation loop pressure seals. The bay had the sound it had when work was being done, tools on metal, the occasional test cycle of equipment, the ordinary operational noise of a functioning maintenance facility. Sanath stood at the entrance and looked at the fault charts on the wall. The buffer ring annotations were at the top of the drive infrastructure sheet. Blue ink for the sensor readings, red for the cross-references, green for the fault-closed notation. He looked at them for a while in a way that was different from both of his previous looks at the charts. Not the look of someone cataloging violations, not the look of someone encountering an artifact of habit. Something more careful than either. The look of someone reading a document they had previously classified incorrectly and are now reclassifying. He said, the Directorate is withdrawing the formal complaint. I said, all right, he said. There will be a revised operational assessment of Bay 7, station level, Directorate input. I cannot confirm the outcome, but my recommendation to the process will be favorable, I said. Whatever the assessment finds. He was quiet for a moment. Something in his posture was different from the inspection visit. The hands at his sides, rather than clasped behind him, the deliberateness present but working toward a different end. He said, the parametric filtering calibration. We were looking for the fault at the wrong point in its progression. I said, yes, he said. Your service record from 18 months ago. The auxiliary unit. That failure mode was documented. I said, in the station log and on the chart. He said, the station log is accessible from any certified terminal. I said, yes. He thought about that for a moment. We didn't find it. I didn't comment on that. It was not a question and it did not need one. He said, the chart showed you the connection. I said, the chart had both records visible at the same time. The new sensor readings and the old service entry, same page. The network would have shown the same information with the right query. The chart showed it without the query because the information was already in front of us. He looked at the charts again. You have maintained records in this form for how long? 25 years. Bay 7 for 11. Before that, every facility I worked in. He said, you always assumed the network could miss something. I said, I assumed the network showed what it was built to show. The charts show what we've noticed. They're different records of different things. Both are useful. He was quiet for a moment. The translation lag meant his next sentence arrived just as his face was settling into the expression that matched it. I was not evaluating outcomes. I was evaluating process alignment. I said, I know. He said, that is not the same evaluation. I said, no. He looked at the charts one more time. Not the assessment look, not the historical curiosity look. The look of someone who has updated a prior conclusion and is deciding what to do with the updated version. He said, the fault was progressing for 6 hours before the cascade would have reached structural compromise. During the entire layover window, he stopped. If the cascade had reached structural compromise before the departure, I said it didn't. He said no. He straightened slightly. Back to formal register. The particular Veth posture that indicated the informal portion of the conversation was complete. "I won't keep you from your work," I said. "Thank you for coming down." He left. I watched him go, then turned back to my bench. After a moment, Orun said, from across the bay, without looking up from the shuttle drive, "He understood." I said, "He understood." 2 weeks later, the technical exchange took place. Dameth, Thys, 2 other senior directorate technicians. 2.5 hours in Bay 7 going through the chart methodology, the analog sensor installation, the probe technique, the fault record. Dameth asked careful questions. Thys examined the probe with the focused attention of someone reverse engineering a technique through direct inspection, which was the most interested he expressed himself. We agreed at the end on a joint documentation protocol that would cross-reference Bay 7's analog monitoring logs with the station's integrated maintenance database. 3 weeks after that, a notation appeared in Kelevar Station's official maintenance registry, filed through the Veth Technical Directorate's records division and carrying directorate endorsement. Bay 7, Kelevar Station. Classification: recommended, unrestricted. I did not post it on the wall. Regulatory documents go in the administrative file, which is where this one went. I did make a note of it in the chart log. In the margin of the current working sheet, in the small, neat handwriting I had been using for 25 years, the date, a reference number, and 2 words. Then I put the kettle on and got back to work. There is a thing that happens in long maintenance work that is difficult to explain to people who have not done it. It has to do with accumulated knowledge, not of systems in the abstract, but of specific systems in specific places, the way they behave under specific conditions over specific time. The knowledge is not entirely in any document. Some of it is in the documents, but documents describe systems as they were built, and systems as they age develop a gap between the documentation and the reality that the documentation does not capture because no one is paid to update the documentation for every variation that emerges from 11 years of operation in a mid-orbit station above a planet with a slightly stronger magnetic field than the station was originally calibrated for. The gap is where experience lives. The fault charts were the physical record of that gap. Every annotation on them represented a moment when what we had observed differed from what the official documentation said we should observe, and we had written it down rather than assuming the documentation was correct and our observation was an error. Most of those moments were small. A pressure reading that ran slightly high in cold cycles, a vibration pattern in the port side exchangers that correlated with specific atmospheric conditions in the habitation ring, a tendency in one of the shuttle drive variants to throw false temperature alerts in the 3rd hour of operation that disappeared on their own and were not a fault. Small things. Things that accumulated over time into a record of how the station actually behaved, as distinct from how it was theoretically supposed to behave. The 18-month-old entry from Bress had been one of those moments. The diagnostic suite said the auxiliary drive unit was clean. The analog rig said it was not. We had written down what the rig said, cross-referenced it to the frequency range, described the failure mode and the failure point in the dampener matrix, and filed the service record. Bress had compressed it all into about 12 words of notation on the chart in his compact system, with the frequency range annotated in the margin. Those 12 words, 18 months later, were the difference between the convoy leaving on schedule and the convoy not leaving. I thought about this while I was cleaning the pressure rig after the job was finished. Not in a self-congratulatory way. The thought was more clinical than that. It was a recognition of how knowledge accumulates in a specific form that isn't a database query and isn't a certified manual and doesn't have an official home in any validated framework, and how that form of knowledge matters in exactly the situations where the validated framework is operating, at the edge of what it was designed to see. Dorrit, who had trained me, had a phrase for this. She said that formal maintenance doctrine was written for the median fault in the median system, at the median point in the operational cycle, and that everything outside the median was where the actual work happened. She said it without bitterness. She was not hostile to formal doctrine. She used it all the time. She respected the engineering behind it. She just knew what it covered and what it did not cover. And she spent her career in the gap. I had spent mine in the gap too, without planning to. It was where Bay 7 had always lived. The buffer ring job was not the first time Bay 7 had caught something the formal diagnostic systems had missed. It was, however, the first time the stakes had been high enough that the institutional record would reflect the gap. There had been the climate exchanger in the civilian ring 7 years ago, where the digital diagnostic showed a nominal fault in the power distribution module, and the actual fault was a progressive blockage in the airflow, calibration vanes that the power distribution diagnostic was not designed to detect. We had found it because one of our crew members, Fen, who had worked in atmospheric systems before coming to Bay 7, had noticed the specific sound the exchanger was making during a routine inspection and had recognized it as the sound of an airflow restriction rather than a power fault. We had reported it, fixed it, logged it. No institutional note was made of the diagnostic gap because the exchanger repair was classified as a Bay 7 operational matter, and the formal system's role in the diagnosis was not mentioned in the report. There had been the secondary propulsion system on the survey shuttle Veth-Grade 3 years ago, where the certified bay that serviced it had replaced the component flagged by the diagnostic twice in 8 months, and the fault had recurred both times. And on the third recurrence, the shuttle's crew had come to us because they were out of patience with the certified result. The actual fault was a flow restriction in a secondary manifold that was not on the diagnostic tools inspection list, because the tools inspection list had been updated after a design change to the shuttle class, and the update had not reached Kelavar's certified bay. We found the restriction in about 40 minutes. The shuttle had been grounded for 3 weeks across 3 repair attempts before that. These were not stories I told anyone. They were service records. They were in the log. The buffer ring job was different because Overseer Damath had seen it happen and had understood what he was seeing. And Veth had been in the access bay while I was working the crawlways, which meant he had also seen it happen rather than reading about it afterward. Seeing a thing happen is different from reading about it. I had found this to be consistently true throughout my career. The formal complaint had been written by a person who had read our service records and drawn conclusions about our methodology. The person who withdrew the formal complaint had watched the methodology work on the most important piece of infrastructure on the station, at the highest stakes moment the station had seen in years, in conditions where the certified methodology was not producing a result. That was not a point I would make to Veth. It would have been true, but making it would have served nothing except my own inclination toward precision. And precision in service of making a point at someone's expense is a different thing from precision in service of doing the work correctly. The work was done correctly. That was the point that needed to make itself. The 3 weeks between Veth-Grade visit and the appearance of the registry notation were ordinary weeks. We finished the shuttle drive rebuild, which came out exactly as it should, and went back to its owner with a full service log and the spare part we'd ordered. Orun finished the pressure seal replacement on the waste reclamation loop, which had been as tedious as he'd predicted and which he was clearly glad to have behind him. We took on 2 new jobs, a hydraulic actuator on a port cargo loader that had been intermittently failing, and a communication array alignment issue on one of the station's tertiary docking approach systems that turned out to be a mounting bracket that had worked loose rather than the alignment fault the initial report had described. The technical exchange with Damath's team happened during these 3 weeks, and it went well in the specific way that technical exchanges between people who are both genuinely interested in the subject go well. The discussion follows the question rather than a prepared agenda. The participants ask better questions as the conversation proceeds. And by the end, the people who came in knowing one set of things know a larger set of things. This took the probe apart during the exchange, with my permission and Oren's assistance, and examined the piezo sensor element with the kind of close attention that suggested he was already thinking about how the design could be improved. I was not offended by this. It was the right way to approach an instrument. Damath asked at one point how we had decided to install the structural mount pressure sensors 4 years ago, what the triggering event had been. I told him about the sensor network gap, the coolant issue, the 4-hour window when we had been running without visibility into a pressure fault that had been building the whole time. He listened carefully. He said, "You decided the network could fail and installed a backup that was independent of it." I said, "I decided I didn't want a repeat of those 4 hours," he said. "An independent backup, not because you distrusted the network, because you recognized that any single system has a failure mode." I said, "Yes." He thought about that for a moment. Then he said the parametric filter calibration was a design assumption that had not been revisited. The assumption was that the early onset signature would not be diagnostically useful, because by the time it was detectable, the standard inspection interval would catch the fault at a later stage. In a system where inspection intervals are regular and conditions are nominal, that assumption holds. I said, "In a system operating under normal conditions with regular access." He said, "In a system operating under normal conditions with regular access." A pause. The buffer ring had been operating under slightly elevated resonance conditions from the convoy's drive systems during the layover. The coupling increased the load on the existing marginal dampener units. It accelerated the onset timeline by, he gave me an estimate, faster than the standard inspection interval would have caught. I said, "Which is why the early onset detection mattered." He said, "Yes." This was not a conversation about which approach was correct. It was a conversation between two people examining a system failure honestly, identifying the assumption that had failed, and thinking about how to prevent the same assumption from failing again. This is what good technical exchange looks like. I had not had many of these conversations with the Veth technical staff in 11 years, partly because our work overlapped rarely, and partly because the credential framework distinction made the relationship formally distant in ways that discouraged it. The buffer ring job had removed some of that distance, not all of it, some. The joint documentation protocol we agreed on was modest and specific. Base 7's analog monitoring logs would be cross-referenced in the station maintenance database on a weekly basis, and any frequency readings outside the documented ambient baseline would generate a flagged entry accessible to both Base 7 and the Directorate technical staff. It was a simple procedure. It addressed one specific gap. That was the right size for an agreement between organizations that had just started talking to each other seriously after 11 years of formal distance. I thought Damath understood this. He struck me as someone who knew the difference between a relationship that had been improved and a relationship that had been transformed, and who did not mistake improvement for transformation. We had improved ours. The transformation, if it happened at all, would take longer and require more of the kind of work we had just begun. That was fine. 11 years of ordinary work had led to one night of necessary work that had led to a revised understanding between two technical operations on the same station. That was a reasonable pace for institutional change. Faster would have been surprising and probably would not have held. The notation in the registry, Base 7, Kelevar Station, recommended, unrestricted, was 2 words where the previous entry had been the classification code that indicated provisional operational status pending review, which was the formal language for the kind of existence Base 7 had been living for 11 years. Here, useful, not quite official. The new notation was official. It meant the Directorate had evaluated the operation and found it worth recommending to other operations in the station network. It meant that ships routing through Kelevar with maintenance requirements would now be pointed toward Bay 7 explicitly rather than discovering us through informal reputation. This would change the work in practical ways. We would get more traffic. Some of it would be work we had not done before, which was the interesting portion. Some of it would be volume of work we already knew how to do, which was the portion that paid the operational budget. I would need to think about staffing. We had run at 5 people, me, Orun, and 3 technicians for the past 4 years, which was the right size for our current load. An increase in referred work would need a 6th person, and possibly 7th, and finding people who fit the way Bay 7 worked was not always fast. I made a note of this in the operational log, marked it for follow-up, and went back to the cargo loader actuator, which had been revealing more interesting history the more I looked at it. 3 previous repairs, each addressing the presenting fault without looking for the underlying cause. The actuator accumulating workarounds like geological strata. I could see the history of each repair in the hardware, the evidence of what each technician had and had not noticed. It was, in its way, a kind of chart. I cleaned the actuator housing, identified the underlying wear pattern, ordered the correct replacement components rather than the component each previous repair had addressed, and wrote up the fault analysis in full. Then I added it to the chart. The cargo loader came back from the actuator job, running correctly for the first time in what the owner said was about 2 years, which suggested the previous 3 repairs had been the kind of repairs that address what is visible without looking for what produced it. He was pleased. He asked if we could handle his other loader as well. I said yes, we could handle it. Bring it in whenever. After he left, I stood at my bench for a moment in the ordinary mid-afternoon quiet of the bay, the charts on the wall, the shuttle drive in the rack behind me, finished and logged. Orun at his station, writing up the pressure seal closure report, with the slightly relieved thoroughness of a man who has finished something he did not enjoy. The tools in their places, the pressure rig clean and stowed, the fault log current, the same bay it had been yesterday, and the day before and the day before that. The classification in the registry was new. The work was the same work. That was exactly right.